I think the most likely outcome here is that President Putin and President Trump spend the meeting feeling each other out, getting a sense of where each side's red lines lie. I think that the United States can learn a lot in this meeting from where Putin might be flexible in terms of making compromises. And my hope is that they come out with, number one, a plan to keep talking at high levels between Trump, Putin, and hopefully at some point Zelensky, as well as a concrete plan to have working level negotiations to start to hash out some of the details that will have to be addressed before any ceasefire or lasting settlement. So that's what I see as a really good outcome, and that's neither punishing sanctions or an end to the war.
Well, maybe it is, in fact, some half measure. The president apparently said on this call today that he hopes to bring a ceasefire from this meeting. Could a ceasefire with Vladimir Putin be trusted?
Well, it depends what the terms of the ceasefire are and what the deal looks like. I think a ceasefire, a full ceasefire coming out of this meeting would be unlikely simply because Zelensky isn't there to participate in the discussion. It's possible that they might agree to some sort of framework deal, like that Putin agrees in principle to a ceasefire on the condition that other issues are worked out, including territorial issues, as well as issues about Western assistance and other types of conditions that the Russians have already laid out and have stuck to throughout the war. It's also possible you might see a partial ceasefire. For example, some people have floated the idea of an air ceasefire, which would limit airstrikes between the two sides, and then the continued fighting would be on the ground. And that would help both sides. Russia has experienced some costs from Ukrainian drone and missile strikes on their oil facilities. And Ukraine is certainly suffering under Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure and cities.
We finally got some details on this meeting, as I'm sure you've seen. It will be in Anchorage at the Elmendorf-Richardson Joint Base. What kind of facilities should be provided here? Do these two meet in a hangar? I keep asking the same question. I'm just wondering what the optics will be. And the idea of Vladimir Putin on a U.S. military base, pretty striking at this particular moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And I had the same sort of thought. I mean, military bases are typically pretty Spartan and not what you normally see for these high level meetings. However, it is also true that, at the commanding general level, there are usually well adorned conference rooms that are used for these types of high level meetings, even among military leaders. So I'm sure that they'll be using, one of these types of more high level and rooms. But I think it is interesting that they chose the military base. Obviously, the choice of Alaska itself is an interesting one. So we'll see what it looks like.
Is this meeting flawed in its initial concept in that it's one-on-one? President talked about maybe a trilateral the second time around, but the idea of President Zelensky waiting by the phone to hear what happened is also curious.
Well, I think that this meeting is really, as President Trump himself has said, and his staff has made clear, a chance for listening and understanding. And the United States and Russia have a bilateral relationship that is quite tense and that exists outside of what's happening in Ukraine. And I do think it's important that the two leaders meet on a at the bilateral level and try to work out some of these issues as well. I think that while the focus will be on Ukraine, it's hard to imagine that some of the bilateral issues between the two nations won't come up. And really, we see here that Zelensky has made clear he's ready for a ceasefire on acceptable terms, and he's willing to at least have negotiations and discussions. We have seen Putin has been much less willing to end this war. So if Putin is the party right now that is harder to bring to the table, it makes sense to have a one-on-one meeting and try to figure out what's required to change that. This is also the format that I think Trump is very comfortable in, these bilateral meetings with other world leaders. And so that's something that he gravitates towards. But he hasn't shown in past phone calls and interactions with Putin over the past 6 or 7 months, he hasn't given any part of Ukraine away. He hasn't sacrificed Ukraine's security or its sovereignty. So I think the idea that he's ready to serve Ukraine on a plate doesn't match up with what we've seen in the recent past.
Well, what do you make of the European counteroffer, if I can call it that? A counteroffer to reports that the lines essentially would be frozen in place. I know the president's talked about land swap, and we don't really have a sense of exactly what that means, but Vladimir Putin wants the Donbass and he wants Crimea. The European leaders on that phone call have a different idea. 1 inch for 1 inch. And this doesn't sound like something that Vladimir Putin is ready to talk about, but any retreat of Ukrainian forces from Ukrainian-controlled territory would be matched inch for inch by Russia's withdrawal from occupied Ukrainian territory. Is there a world in which that could happen?
Oh, I mean, it's not out of the question. It just the question is, what are the other terms of the ceasefire, and what do those land swaps look like? I mean, in any sort of ceasefire, there are adjustments to the line. So even if the line is frozen where the front line currently is, and that becomes the new de facto border, it would be expected that there would be adjustments to that line to make sure that cities are on one side or the other, to make sure that geographic features, are taken into account. So I think that this idea of land swaps, we may not be talking about huge swaths of territory. And Russia has put forward a set of conditions. One set of conditions is this Ukrainian withdrawal from territory that it currently controls. But there's another set of conditions, another ceasefire option that Putin has put on the table, and that is freezing the conflict along the current front line. But then it comes with other conditions, including things like freezing of Western security assistance aid, limits or demobilization, which would shrink the size of Ukraine's military. So Putin has suggested some flexibility in setting out a range of terms. So we shouldn't fixate only on territory here. It's not the only issue that's at stake.